Good morning and welcome to session number 5 of the 23rd Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. Today's date is September 22nd, 2023. This session is titled ILL Purchase on Demand, A Decade in the Making, and this will be presented by Elise, Thornley, and Barbara Blake. My name is Katie DeVette, and I am the convener for today's session. This session is being recorded with the permission from the presenters. Because they retain the copyright to the information they are presenting, they may choose to request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to Northwest ILL. However, at this time, it is planned that recordings will be made available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn live captioning on, click the CC link at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitles. If you have a question during the session, please use the Q&A function in Whova, and I will pose these to the presenter at the end of their presentation. We will not be monitoring the chat for questions. When the presentation ends, please complete the post-session survey in Whova, located on the conference homepage and the session chat. We'll drop this in the chat shortly. Northwest ILL and its presenters appreciate and use your feedback. On that note, Elise and Barbara, have at it.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Elise Thornley, and Barbara Blake is also here. We're from Binghamton University, and we're excited that you're here to join us to hear about our Purchase on Demand program, ILL Purchase on Demand, a decade or a little more in the making. So quick introductions. Like I just said, I'm Elise Thornley. I am the Senior Associate Head of Resource Sharing here at Binghamton University. I oversee resource sharing, the department, as well as its 5 employees. I provide oversight at other library locations. I've been here at Binghamton since 2008. I started in resource sharing as a student assistant, and once I graduated with my undergrad, very luckily got a job here at the libraries, where I've been ever since. In 2017, I received my LIS at Syracuse. I'm also pretty active in the community. I serve as an IDS project peer advisor, and I'm also serving on the SCRLC South Central Regional Library Council Resource Sharing Advisory Committee here in New York State. I'm also interested in leadership development and supporting my staff and supervision as some other interests.
Hi there, my name is Barbara Blake, she, her pronouns. I am the resource sharing assistant at Binghamton University Libraries, where I oversee primarily borrowing and document delivery processes. However, I'm considered a bit of a Jane of all trades, playing a part in circulation and course reserves management as well. I'm a Binghamton University alumnus, and I hold a BA in English literature and general rhetoric and a minor in education. I've been working in various capacities for the Binghamton University Library since 2017, where I started as a student assistant worker. And when I graduated in 2018, I returned as a full-time staff member, first in the course reserves department, and then finally moving into resource sharing in 2020, where I've been in my current position ever since. My professional interests include increasing accessibility within access services and advocating for students from non-traditional backgrounds.
So, for those of you who are not familiar with Binghamton University, we are located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Onondaga Nation, and they are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Binghamton has approximately 18,000 full-time enrolled students, undergraduates, graduates, and their PhDs. There are 4 libraries at Binghamton: the Bartle Library, Science, University Downtown Center, and CMF Annex. Bartle, Science, and UDC are all collections and student-centered spaces, while the CMF Annex is our offsite storage facility. The Annex is actually transitioning to the CMF as we speak. Got some really great folks working to make sure that happens, and that's set to be completed this November, and we will have high-density storage at our new facility. There are 6 full-time employees, myself included, in our department, with many part-time folks at all library locations, as well as many wonderful student employees who help keep our ILL business running. We use ILLiad with OCLC and Rapid, as well as Alma resource sharing for processing interlibrary loan requests, and some quick data about our last fiscal year 21-22. We borrowed 14,716 materials. We lent a little over 17,000, and we were able to provide almost 12,000 through document delivery from our own collection. Here's our quick agenda for today. We're going to be discussing the program origins of Purchase on Demand. There was Pilot 1, and as you can see here, there is Pilot 2. So discussing, the failures of the first pilot and the successes of the second pilot. Looking at our almost first full year of our POD program, and then looking to the future and seeing where we can grow. And of course, there will be time for Q&A at the end. I see some good questions that folks submitted, so thank you so much.
All right, before we move into the bulk of today's presentation, there are a few key takeaways and ideas that we'd like for you all to keep in mind as we work through the presentation. Some food for thought, if you will. The first key concept is that a demand-driven acquisitions program is really only as successful as the administrative support behind it. Number 2, too many restrictions on a program can actually harm its success. If you are going to adopt a purchase on demand or a demand-driven acquisitions program, don't be afraid to go all in and to perhaps give less restrictions than you would compared to other programs to enhance its success. And number 3, embrace changes and modifications. Trial and error is the key to success, and as evident through the past 10 years with POD, it's a lot of innovation, a lot of changes, and a lot of willingness to revise and reinvent the program that led to its success. So basically, you need your administrative support. You can't be too restrictive, and embrace change, and don't necessarily see the need for change as indicative of failure. Take it as an opportunity instead.
Okay, so we're going to explore the early POD pilot, and the timeline for this began in 2009 and it ended in 2016, so about 7-ish years. So the original pilot, like I said, began in 2009, 2019. Ugh, years are hard these days. So we had a part-time person who processed borrowing loans, who was housed in cataloging and acquisitions as some context. So due to, that and the borrowing department wanting to do some more work with technical services, it was actually moved from reader services, which is our equivalent to access services here, to tech services in 2010. And unfortunately, the POD program was not successful, and also due to some staffing changes at that time, borrowing moved back into reader services at the end of 2013. And so even though borrowing had moved back to reader services, the part-time staff person who was part-time resource sharing, part-time cataloging, still continued to process loan requests and those POD requests until about 2016, when they were moved to do full-time work in tech services. Here is our criteria and workflow for that early first POD pilot. As you can see, it's pretty restrictive, which is part of the reason why it was not successful. So the person submitting the request needed to be faculty. They could only request physical books, which were published in the last 2 calendar years. Those books needed to be published through University Press, cost $75 or less, and needed to be purchased through very specific vendors. The workflow would be that, any faculty could submit this request as they normally would through ILLiad. The staff who I mentioned earlier would identify that POD request, email our head of acquisitions and borrowing staff to let them know. They would route the request appropriately in ILLiad, and then the head of acquisitions would determine if the material could be purchased. And there was a very quick turnaround time. So if we didn't hear from that acquisitions head in one business day, we would just obtain it through our regular ILL channels. So pros and cons. There were some pros to this program. So this kind of patron-driven acquisition, this collaboration between resource sharing and acquisitions was newer for Binghamton. It helped change the thinking around that, which I think set it up for success in the later pilot. We were able to also acquire almost 160 books for the collection, which is definitely a plus and things that faculty members wanted. It also gave another channel for faculty to submit their requests for approval. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, it was a very restrictive program and only a limited number of requests could be fulfilled based on all of the purchases criteria. There was no leeway for other patron requests, so it was just faculty, no grad, no undergrad, and faculty already have some good relationships built with their subject librarians, so they could fulfill these purchase needs another way or through even, we have a form on our website that anyone can submit to and that our subject librarians will review. And also at the time, thinking 2009, ebook purchasing was much more limited than what it was today. The higher costs, limited user access. So that was unfortunately a reality. But as I think we've seen in the past, at least 5 years, there's been a big increase in ebook accessibility. So round two, second time's definitely the charm. So after the first failure, we, is resource sharing, we're still interested in purchase on demand and maybe a second pilot. So what was great was collections folks had their meeting and were talking about the same thing. So our interests really aligned and it provided this opportunity for us. So we created a working group with representation from many different areas, including acquisitions, the collections team, resource sharing, folks who had some duties in administration, and we take a look at those stats from the original pilot and really all agreed that they were way too restrictive for it to be successful. So that's when I went into ILLiad and dug through our stats for what could be part of this pilot, because part of working with folks who aren't as familiar with ILLiad is to show them, hey, we're not going to get 500 requests in a month for purchase on demand, to show them that this could be a realistic activity we could all do together. So by sharing these stats, pulling data about faculty, about grads, we were able to set new parameters for this pilot. And from this, we had our new pilot, we developed workflows, and it features a much less restrictive workflow and a formal budget.
All right. Now, as you can see from here, the criteria for requests for the second round of the pilot are much less restrictive than they were versus the original round. So to begin, the patron status has been opened where it's not just faculty members anymore, but PhD and graduate students, although they do have some different restrictions as we will get into further on. Additionally, the patron would indicate that the material should be purchased, which would include a small little notation to be left into our ILLiad form. I will note that although this was a criteria, it was not the most pertinent criteria for items, even if a patron did not necessarily indicate the material to be purchased. If it did meet other criteria, we would kind of overrule and make our own decision. We would only purchase book requests only. We have a separate process in place for article and journal requests that exceed copyright limitations. They would be limited to English language publications only. For faculty status publication, publishers were expanded to pretty much anyone and anything if we could obtain it, whereas graduate students were limited to university press only publications. All materials had to be published within the last five calendar years. And could not be awaiting publication. If that were to happen, we would just cancel the request and ask them to resubmit once the material was available for purchase. The material could not already be owned by Binghamton University. However, if it was owned in the past, but is currently had a status of lost or missing, we would continue the purchase on demand process. Basically, on the idea that this is still a material that isn't high enough demand. Rather than the $75 restriction, we expanded that to $300, which greatly enabled us to secure more ebook licenses. The materials had to be available in either Gobi for electronic or physical materials, or on Amazon if the material was solely a physical book. For all purchase materials, for all purchase requests, an ebook format was preferred, but a physical book was chosen instead if the ebook costs were too exorbitant for our purposes. And finally, we prioritize in terms of accessibility, multi-user format ebooks, with the hopes that we'd be able to supply the book to more and more of our patrons versus a actual physical material. With those criteria in place, we were able to establish a nice, thorough workflow. So from start to finish, how it would work is that a patron would submit a request to either the ILLiad program, or they would submit a request online through our catalog, in which it would be submitted through Alma, and if exhausted through all our resource sharing lenders, it would then be routed into the ILLiad platform. So to summarize, the request would ultimately lie within the ILLiad platform. Once submitted to the ILLiad platform, we had established routing rules in place to vet requests that were published within the past 5 years into two separate categories that an ILL staff member could then check daily. So instead of having a staff member look through all the requests and making their own judgments on whether or not material qualify for purchase on demand, our routing rules were already identifying materials that met certain criteria. And again, the published within the past 5 years was the most important routing rule of these. After once these requests were routed to the appropriate queues, a staff member would simply review the request, compare it to the remaining criteria, and if the material seemed to be appropriate, met all conditions, then the staff member would automatically notify an acquisition staff member using a built-in email template right through the ILLiad platform. And we can actually see that template right here on our slide today. If the request did not meet any criteria for whatever reason, we would simply reroute that item back to the rating request processing queue and would go through for traditional ILL processing. Once a request has been submitted to acquisitions, it's just a matter of waiting to hear a response. If acquisitions approve the request, they would oftentimes just go forward with ordering it, and we would just need to check either the patron's Alma account to ensure that a email notification was sent to them indicating the material is now available, or alternatively, and perhaps quicker, just take a look on the catalog to see if the item has become available. It's a pretty thorough process. Acquisitions takes ownership of notifying the patron through automatic processing through acquisitions workflows. So it's a rather seamless process compared to the more manual handling versus the first round pilot.
So these are what our ILLiad routing rules look like Barbara was talking about. Anything published in the last 5 calendar years submitted by faculty, grad students, and PhD, not shown here, were directed to those custom queues in ILLiad for Barbara, who was instrumental in this program, to take a look at, make sure they meet the requirements, and then if they do, contact the folks to get that material purchased. So pilot round 2, results and improvements. So our pilot timeline was November 2021 through 2022. We were originally given a very, very kind budget of $40,000, which we did not spend, but we did spend $18,600 of it, which was very much appreciated. As you can see here, the original pilot had 159 requests, and just in 1 year alone, we were able to purchase 141 materials for our patrons. So 130 of those were ebooks and 11 were print. Based on those criteria Barbara mentioned, majority of those were for faculty. And in fact, 17% of those faculty requests through ILLiad ended up going through POD, which is great. We were able to get them those materials and add them to our collection. Unfortunately, the grad students didn't have as many requests go through. There were only 16 total. So that's something we'll talk about in a little bit. But the overall turnaround time for obtaining these materials and getting them to our activated for our patrons in the case of ebooks, or getting them to our patrons. The average turnaround time for ebooks was 3 to 4 days, which is pretty reasonable. And unfortunately, 27 days for print. So we had something to kind of take a look at there and make some modifications.
Right. So I think that we are still on, or we're moving on to improvements. Oh, right. My apologies there. I thought we were moving on to the next slide yet. So given these statistics, we have a couple suggestions for improvements to better the pilot round 2 and make it into a more official program. The number one most telling problem, as evidenced from the amount of canceled requests, rejected requests, is that we desperately need to expand graduate student restrictions. They are the universe, very few, my apologies there. Very few graduate student requests actually qualified under the university press limitation. So we ended up canceling a great number of requests for these patrons. In addition, it really begged the question about what the demand would look like for these options and what it would look like if we were to expand them. So that was the number one thing that we wanted to look at doing. The second challenge that we observed is that some patrons, even though we did supply an ebook, some patrons simply don't want them. There were several times where we went and we provided an ebook license and activated it and purchased the material for our patrons. And then when they received the activation link and reminder, they came back to us saying, like, while I am very grateful that you're able to acquire this resource, a physical copy is more conducive to my workflows. So trying to better communication so we can go and best suit our patron needs in that regard was definitely something that we can take a look at. Perhaps the best form of mediation would be just simply communicating with the patrons ahead of time, or be more public facing about our POD process. The third and final thing that we noticed is that it is very easy, particularly with the development of routing rules, it's very easy for one individual patron to dominate the purchase on demand queues. We have a number of very, very wonderful humanities instructors and history instructors who have been excited about the new research that has come in these days. But unfortunately, when we first started the program, we realized we had to very quickly intervene and contact this patron to be like, hey, we have this new thing going on, this new program going on. Do you actually want these purchased for the libraries, or would you prefer us to get through ILL? So communicating expectations for the patron and our own expectations led to success, but that was definitely a slight oversight, you could say, on our behalf. So cumulatively, my apologies, this was the slide that I thought we were moving on to before, but I let myself get a bit ahead of myself. So comparing the statistics of the pilot round 2 versus pilot round 1, there are a couple key takeaways to look at about what led to the success, to our success. The first thing is that we had greater departmental and administrative support behind the program. It's not to say that we did not have it the first time around, but because we had better statistics to show the growth and change of the program and what could happen if we were to relook and restructure it, we were able to really get the strength and support to go forward and really bring the purchase on demand program to what it actually could be, rather than the more restrictive process that it was. So having that departmental and administrative support behind us was very integral to our success. And going along with that is that having that success allowed us to lessen our restrictions and parameters surrounding the nature of what counted for a purchase on demand request and what did not. I feel as my colleague Elise here has mentioned, is that it's very critical to note that the mindset surrounding data patron-driven acquisitions programs was very different in 2019 compared to what it is today, and that is part of what allowed for the allowed for our success. Acquisitions, particularly at our institution, was more open to the idea of patron-driven collections versus in the past, but there's a little bit more of a fear that there's a little bit more of a conservative mindset around that and around the budgets. So having that change of mindset definitely integral, and that has been something that has been more of a library science expansion. And in addition to that is that development and acquisitions programs made the actual workflow a lot easier. When we were first starting adopting this program, we actually were adopting the Rialto program, which allowed the workflow for our acquisitions team to become so much more simpler. A lot more things were automated, streamlined. So there was no back and forth between several different systems to notify the patron that a material was available, to get it into the catalog. Really, Rialto allowed for this program to not just grow, but to become more simple. And then finally, we really cannot go without discussing the impact COVID-19 has had on the importance of developing a more electronic, accessible collection. I dare say that this definitely has touched base and given some impact onto those other points that we talked about departmental support, administrative support, and support behind data-driven collections, because we saw what happened necessarily when a crisis occurred. So accessibility definitely a more important component here in this work.
So after we presented this pilot data to our collections and instructions team, the group was in full support and very excited to make this a permanent program. And they were also really supportive of making those changes, or some of the changes that we were able to make at the time to support the new program. So we had our big happy yay moment. We have a permanent POD program as of last November 2022. And we were given a budget of $20,000, which is part of the collections budget, but it's earmarked just for purchase on demand for ILL. And we were able to make some of those additional changes in order to support the program based on the data that we've just shared about the pilot.
Excellent. So this is currently what the finalized POD program at Binghamton University currently looks like from 2022, 2023, and onwards. So some of the key updates that we made based off of the round 2 data is that we decided the very first key improvement that we decided to make was to expand those publisher restrictions for graduate students' POD requests. Doing this without a doubt significantly affected our numbers, as we will discuss very shortly. And again, the use and development of Rialto within our acquisitions process not only streamlined things for acquisitions, but also allowed us to take ownership of the POD program and control over these requests right directly underneath research sharing. So instead of having to wait necessarily for a response from our acquisitions team, we were allowed to take ownership of those decisions and work on that criteria directly ourselves. So now when we receive a request, rather than sending a notification to our acquisitions team, we simply notify our senior head of resource sharing, Elise Thornley, and she will go and make those decisions as soon as possible, and allows us to basically process these requests a lot faster. So very, very simple, very, very, very seamless. And let's take a look at our wonderful numbers for the past year from 2022 to 2023. The very first thing that we can see is that our graduate student requests, since we opened up those restrictions, is that we had an over 150% increase in fulfillment, which is quite spectacular. So definitely, if you're thinking of adopting this type of program yourself, definitely look at expanding beyond the university publisher restriction. Even though we have a healthy budget, we still didn't even come close to exceeding it. So that's also a plus going in our department. And for the current fiscal year, we're also looking quite good. Honestly, even a little bit better than we were this time last year. We already have made just over $6,000 of our budget spent and 38 requests being filled. So looking good so far. Excited to see where this year takes us.
And so what would this be without usage data? So just as a side note, since this program is so new, the usage data is not super robust, but we are excited to see where our data leads us into the future. So we used Alma Analytics to pull this usage data. Big thanks to our head of collections for setting up this report for us, saving us a lot of time there. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but I should include anything purchased around or before May 2023. So the great news is that all the materials we have purchased have been used at least once. And about 91% of those materials were actually used more than once, and 55% of those materials were used more than 5 times, which brings us to an average of a book being accessed 7 times, and that's just since 2022 for some, or even less for others. So that's really great. that's the stuff we want to see. These materials are being used, and we mentioned earlier too. Some folks said, "Oh, thank you for getting this ebook for me. I may not use it. I'd prefer print." And it looks like the materials are still being used, even not by the requesting patron, which is ultimately what you want to have a healthy collection. The most accessed materials, as you can see, are very different titles, both accessed 19 times. The first is Venetian Shipping from the Days of Glory to Decline. We are thinking that maybe one person or maybe 1 or 2 people access that, as opposed to Managing Your Mental Health During Your PhD, which is a really applicable topic, I think, in higher ed. So we're excited to see where this data takes us in the future, what data we'll have to work with, what we'll have to share, and how we can continue to improve and finesse this program as time goes on.
And speaking of the future, we're already looking towards it. We have a lot of different ideas on how to expand and adapt the program. The very first thing that we're looking at doing, that I'm very excited to start exploring, is seeing how we can use resource sharing, our Purchase on Demand program, to assist our leisure reading collection. One of our subject librarians, Jennifer Embry, has developed a very, very wonderful collection of popular fiction and nonfiction books that has been insanely popular amongst our patrons of all demographic groups. And we're very excited to see what data we can pull to support that collection. One of the things that might be the most useful is utilizing undergraduate statistics. We've noticed within the past 2 calendar years that quite a lot of undergraduates actually utilize resource sharing to what I like to call sample the books that they want to buy. They're using it a lot for their leisure reading, to identify new books that they want to read, that they want to purchase for their own collections. We've already preliminarily used some of our data to support the collection in buying the seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and an additional copy of Atomic Leadership. But yeah, very useful tool. I will also tell folks to not underestimate the power of book talk. If you are on book talk and think that you might be hearing a book that is about to become popular, it's very likely about to do just that. Beyond our leisure collection, we're excited to see how we can leverage our resource sharing statistics to amplify our course reserves collection, and see what we can do to amplify and streamline that service. Particularly wondering if there's a way that we could collect all acquisitions formats in reader services, kind of under the umbrella of resource sharing, or in one singular avenue for our patrons, so that things are a little bit more seamless. And finally, we just want to see the full extent of what our usage data could mean for collections, see if there are any other adaptations that we need to do. Maybe we need to be looking at expanding even more restrictions that we have.
And so in conclusion, as we said, a purchase on demand program is really as successful as the support you have behind it. So it's important to get your ILL, your resource sharing team on board, but it's also important to get other folks in the libraries on board, other folks in different departments, or your administrators, as much as you can. And in order to do that, you may need to, and you probably should, collect and share statistics to support your pilot or your program. That was one of the main reasons that this was successful, because it can alleviate some concerns or fears or questions that other folks may have, and it will set you up for success. So then you can look back on that data and kind of, see where things were based on your stats and based on reality. Collaboration was key, and I cannot thank our colleagues here at Binghamton enough in acquisitions and collections and admin and just in public services for their support with this and for their collaborative nature. That is really key to having a successful program. And by having that collaborative work done, you can also help develop those workflows that are sustainable. So folks in other departments, like in our instance in acquisitions, didn't have to do as much of that lift once we were able to use Rialto to purchase those materials automatically here in resource sharing. And finally, you want to build a program that's adaptable. You never know what the future will bring, as we've all seen. There might be different needs that your library or your patrons have, and it's good to kind of keep that in mind as you're building your program. And that leads us to the end of our presentation here, and we're excited to answer these many questions we've been seeing pop up.
All right, so with that, we're going to move on to our questions. We're going to start with the most upvoted one. Do purchase on demand criteria match your general collection development policies, or are they different? If they are different, what is the reasoning for that?
I'll jump on that one. They do match our general development policies. We're leaning more towards purchasing e-resources, which this is modeling, and we did develop the criteria with collections folks and their team, and we do get their feedback. So totally in line.
Very good. So is all of your purchasing restricted to University Press?
No.
So that part didn't?
No, that No, that was an original criteria, and we purchase many different kinds of materials by many different publishers.
Very good, very good. Do you attempt to borrow first and then purchase? The original asker says that's how we purchase on demand in our library. We only buy ILL request items if we cannot find a lender.
Not here in our case. Our only restriction is whether or not we currently own the material, and if we do not own the material, we pretty much go forward with the purchase. That's our only restriction.
Very good. Do you purchase textbooks? This asker says they imagine they get a ton of textbook requests if we did this. And sorry that we're having a little bit of inception going on here if you're seeing multiple versions of your Hoova screen.
So actually, no, we have not honestly had any instances really of textbooks coming through here. So one of the things that we are doing preemptively behind the scenes is that our borrowing staff are checking all items against the bookstore list that our course reserves team pulls directly from the bookstore. So any items that pop up in our queues that qualify for that, we're automatically canceling and redirecting to course reserves. There are times in cases where, like, if multiple, like a huge number of requests are coming in, we do not currently own the material, where we will just contact our course reserves team and be like, hey, we might want to look at purchasing this book for the libraries, and start that conversation ahead of time. I will usually be the one to do that because I have a closer collaborative relationship with our course reserves team due to my history with it. But no, we actually have not surprisingly had a ton of textbook requests come through because we are vetting for them in advance.
Very good, very good. Do you actually get a full list of textbooks every semester? Because ours won't do that.
So the wonderful thing that we have going on is that our bookstore team, they use a online dashboard weird service. And they gave us administrative access to go online as one of their staff member would, and basically download the list in real time. So we have that lookup option. We're able to pull that list and that material ourselves. Before we had that option, we were just manually checking the bookstore, looking up each and every pulling a list of every single course, looking up that course on the bookstore, and then figuring out materials from then. But then a update happened to the website where that was no longer feasible, so we needed to come up with a different way. And fortunately, our bookstore has been very receptive to that. I think Ithaca College also does a very, very similar process where they have the same type of access.
Fantastic, that's great. Do you have suggestions on how to get administration on board to approve ILL purchase on demand? The asker's institution is concerned about cost.
I'm happy to jump in, and Barbara, if you have suggestions too. I think that's where it's really important to incorporate your data and pull that data from whatever platform, if you're using ILLiad, WorldShare, Alma, resource sharing, whatever you're using. You might want to think about what your dream would be for those criteria, or start collaborating with folks that might be interested in partnering, like acquisitions folks or folks in collections, and say, hey, what do you think about this? I think that's gonna set you up for success. And maybe say, hey, we know realistically we can't afford $100,000 budget, but maybe we can afford a $5,000 budget, and we can focus on these sorts of parameters, and then find a compromise with those folks. Because once you get your foot in the door, I think it's a little easier to continue to make that case, especially if you can say, hey, we've had a successful program, here's the usage, patrons are really excited, and go from there.
Fantastic. I think you spoke about this a little bit, but can you give us some more details on what data prompted you to restart the purchase on demand program?
So it was a really fortuitous time. I was discussing this with the team a little bit, with my supervisor, about really wanting to get back into POD, especially since we were starting to settle in a little more after the pandemic, or during the pandemic. It was 2021. But similar conversations were being had in collections. And so we just had the stars aligned, I guess, as they say. And we were able to look back at that data, because by then different folks had kind of come and gone, and they were like, yikes, this previous pilot was too restrictive. And so that's when I could say, I have the data, let me show you where we can go from here, or what we could do, or what would we want to do. And that was where we kind of found our success.
Fantastic. There is a question: why was the original limited to university press books? Was that y'all's decision? Did someone else decide it for you?
No, and it was a different, our department and our library has really evolved since 2009. So it was just a different time, a different collections kind of mindset, and ebooks were also not as popular back then as they are today. So I think it was just trying to limit the amount of requests that might come in, or make sure they were indeed scholarly and not The Many Wives of Evelyn Hugo, which great book, but maybe not considered for purchase on demand, but maybe could be, like as Barbara has said earlier, considered for our other collections to be purchased.
Sure. Do you have a hard limit on the number of items you'll buy for an individual patron, or is it just kind of figuring it out as you go along?
I'd say it's definitely figuring out as we go along. I'd say like more than 2 requests for the same patron come in within, like, I would say a period of 2 months. Then we might have to have like a little conversation, being like, hey, this is something that this is this new program that we have. What necessarily do you need and are interested in having? Like, do you see as a valid, worthwhile item for the collection, versus is this something that you're just trying to check a reference for? Opening up those lines of conversation and just keeping track of it. really has been the most successful for us. I also dare say that it probably doesn't hurt that at this particular moment, only one staff member, myself, is vetting the request. So I have a pretty good idea of who requested what and who is what seems to be a little bit unreasonable. So having one person managing it also a little bit in our favor.
Very good, very good. And we have time for just one more question. This writer is curious as to why you would need a separate budget for the program. Couldn't it just be considered one of your collection development tools and then under the general acquisitions budget?
Yes, and so I actually saw this during the presentation. I was like, yes, very good question. It is part of our collections budget. It's earmarked for resource sharing purchase on demand. So it's part of our greater budget. Yes, that would be maybe a little strange for ILLiad just to have this $20,000 budget for this one thing outside of collections. It'd probably make things a lot harder to track and keep an eye on. So that's a very, very good question.
Very good. And we did something similar at our library. So there are a few more questions that are still in our Q&A that Elise and Barbara can take a look through afterwards. And now that we're at the end of our time, Northwest ILL thanks all of you for attending this session titled ILL Purchase on Demand, a Decade in the Making. Please fill out the post-session survey. The link can be found on the conference front page and will be dropped back into the Whova chat in case you've lost it. Additionally, if you have enjoyed this session and want to continue the conversation, you are more than welcome to continue to use the chat within the session or move over to our community section of Whova, where you can use chat boards or create a virtual meetup. Elise and Barbara, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all.